The Philadelphia Eagles are getting closer and closer to one of the most interesting points of the preseason because roster cutdown day is approaching, and with that comes a very important question. Could Howie Roseman make a trade or even multiple trades before the regular season begins? When you look at Howie Roseman's history, this should not be a surprising possibility. The Eagles have repeatedly used the preseason as an opportunity to evaluate their roster, identify weaknesses, and then make moves when the right opportunity appears. The idea is not simply to trade players because a trade is available. The strategy is to use training camp and preseason games to learn exactly what this roster looks like, and then address areas that may still need improvement, and that history is significant. Since 2016, Philadelphia has been involved in a long list of trades during this part of the calendar. The Eagles have moved players such as Dennis Kelly, Sam Bradford, Alan Barwin, Jordan Matthews, Matt Tobin, and John Dorenbos. Philadelphia also traded for players such as Gardner Minshew, CJ Gardner-Johnson, and Sam Howell, while making other roster moves involving players like Matt Pryor, Jalen, and others. So when you put all of that together, it becomes reasonable to watch Howie Roseman very closely right now. The Eagles have spent the preseason collecting information. Now comes the part where the front office has to decide which players truly belong on this roster and whether another team might be willing to offer something valuable for someone Philadelphia has available. One of the most interesting situations involves the quarterback room. Tanner McKee and Andy Dalton are two names that immediately stand out. At one recent practice, McKee was working as QB2, Dalton was QB3, and Cole Payton was QB4. That creates a very interesting roster situation because it is difficult to imagine Philadelphia keeping all of these options in exactly the same roles. McKee's situation is particularly important because the source describes him as significantly ahead of Dalton based on what was seen in the preseason game against New England. If Jalen Hurts were to miss time, the question becomes very simple. Who gives Philadelphia the better chance to compete? Based on the evaluation presented here, McKee would be the preferred option. At the same time, Cole Payton has shown enough to make his situation fascinating. He received nearly a quarter of the snaps in the first preseason game, and the evaluation in the source is that he is an intriguing developmental quarterback. But there is another problem. Exposing him to waivers could mean another team claims him. That creates a situation where Philadelphia could potentially have to make a difficult decision involving Dalton, McKee, or Payton. And this is where a trade becomes interesting. Andy Dalton may not appear to have enormous trade value, but he is an experienced veteran who could potentially interest another team looking for help at backup quarterback. The Eagles just acquired him, and experience at that position can have value when another team suddenly needs depth. Then there is Kelee Ringo. Ringo is another player whose future becomes interesting when you look at Philadelphia's depth at cornerback. He may not be positioned to receive a large number of defensive snaps, but he has made plays during the preseason. Vic Fangio's evaluation was that Ringo needs to become more consistent, but the young corner has still shown athletic ability and enough coverage potential to make him interesting to another team. That does not automatically mean the Eagles should trade him. In fact, there is a strong argument for keeping him because of his special teams value and the fact that he remains affordable on his rookie contract. But if another team needs an outside corner and sees potential in Ringo, Philadelphia could potentially receive something in return. The wide receiver room creates another interesting possibility. The Eagles are described as being deep at receiver even with Johnny Wilson out for the season. That puts players such as Elijah Moore and Hollywood Brown into a fascinating position. Both could potentially become trade candidates if Philadelphia believes it can use one of them to address a different weakness or acquire additional draft capital. At the same time, the evaluation is that both Elijah Moore and Hollywood Brown can make this roster, so this is not a situation where Philadelphia necessarily needs to move either player. Instead, it is about opportunity. If another team comes to Howie Roseman with an offer that solves a more important problem, does the general manager consider moving a player from a position where the Eagles have depth? The offensive line gives us another name to watch. Fred Johnson. Markel Bell has developed quickly, and the Eagles are developing him at right tackle after he played left tackle at Miami. The source views Philadelphia's offensive line depth as significantly better than it was last year, and that could potentially make Fred Johnson expendable if the Eagles believe Bell can provide the swing tackle role. Then we get to linebacker, where the Eagles appear to have another difficult roster decision. Philadelphia has several young linebackers competing for opportunities, including Zach Bond, Jahad Campbell, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., and other young players mentioned in the source. Smile Mondon is viewed as someone who could eventually become a starter. That depth creates a very different type of problem for Howie Roseman. Not a lack of talent, but potentially having more players than available roster spots. And Carson Steele certainly made that conversation more interesting. Against New England, Steele produced more than 100 all-purpose yards and had a couple of impressive hurdles, including one that resulted in a touchdown. That raises a major question about whether Philadelphia wants to carry 4 running backs. If the Eagles decide they do not have room for everyone, a player like Steele could potentially attract interest from another team that needs help at running back. AJ Epineza is another name worth watching. He has been productive during his career with the Buffalo Bills, and the emergence of Joshua Weathers could potentially affect how Philadelphia evaluates its defensive line depth. Epineza also has an affordable contract, making him potentially attractive to another team if the Eagles decide they have enough depth at that position. But perhaps the most difficult name in this entire conversation is Jeremiah Trotter Jr. The idea of trading Trotter Jr. is not something that should be taken lightly. The source describes him as a high-level starting caliber player who could make an impact on this Eagles defense this season. So why even consider moving him? Because the value of a trade can sometimes force a front office to make an uncomfortable decision. If Philadelphia received a 3rd-round pick for Trotter Jr., that would already be a significant return. What if the offer became a 2nd-round pick? At that point, Howie Roseman would have to decide whether the immediate value of the draft capital outweighs the potential impact of keeping a young linebacker who could become an important piece of the defense. And that is really the heart of this entire story. The Eagles do not appear to be looking for trades simply because they can make them. The bigger issue is whether the preseason has revealed enough information to show that one part of the roster is stronger than expected while another part still needs help. That is exactly the kind of situation where Howie Roseman has historically become aggressive. There are also actual trade ideas being discussed around the Eagles. One proposal would send Fred Johnson to the Los Angeles Rams in exchange for tight end Davis Allen. That idea is based on Philadelphia's offensive tackle depth and the Rams' need for additional tackle depth, while Allen could potentially provide another option at tight end. Philadelphia already has Dallas Goedert as an excellent receiving tight end, while the roster also has other players competing for roles at the position. The question is whether someone like Davis Allen could become useful enough to justify bringing him into the room, particularly if Philadelphia believes it can afford to move a veteran tackle. And there is another proposed trade that would bring back a familiar name, Mack Hollins. The idea would send Philadelphia a former Eagle who has developed into a reliable locker room presence, willing blocker and physical receiver. Hollins was part of the Eagles as a rookie in 2017 and caught some memorable passes from Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. That proposal becomes especially interesting because Philadelphia's wide receiver room is already one of the deepest areas being discussed. So if the Eagles were to make a move for another receiver, the question would immediately become, what problem are they trying to solve? And that brings us right back to Howie Roseman. With roster cutdown approaching, every one of these names becomes more important. A player who looks like a lock today could become trade bait tomorrow if the Eagles believe another team will offer something valuable. And a player who looks expendable could suddenly become important if an injury changes the equation. So Eagles fans, if you were Howie Roseman right now, which player would you consider trading, and what kind of return would be enough to make you pull the trigger? And this is where the trade conversation gets even more interesting, because the Eagles are not only evaluating their own roster, other teams around the league are also trying to figure out which players could become available before the regular season, and that can create opportunities for Howie Roseman. One trade idea discussed involves the Eagles and the Rams, with Philadelphia receiving tight end Davis Allen in exchange for Fred Johnson. The logic behind the proposal is fairly straightforward. Philadelphia has developed Markel Bell into a potential swing tackle option, while Fred Johnson has experience playing both left and right tackle. That could give the Eagles enough confidence in their depth to consider moving Johnson if the return helps another part of the roster. For the Rams, the appeal would be having an experienced offensive tackle who can provide depth at both sides of the line. For Philadelphia, the question would be whether Davis Allen could give the Eagles something they currently need at tight end. That is not an easy decision because Philadelphia already has Dallas Goedert, and the Eagles have other players competing for roles at the position. But the source points out an interesting possibility with Eli Stowers. Coming out of Vanderbilt, some teams viewed Stowers as a potential bigger wide receiver rather than strictly as a traditional tight end. Philadelphia even used him out wide during the second preseason game. That matters because the Eagles lost Johnny Wilson for the season, and the team has a relatively small average height at wide receiver. If Stowers can eventually give the offense some of that size and versatility, Philadelphia may have another reason to keep him around while continuing to develop him. So if the Eagles were to bring in Davis Allen, they would have to determine exactly what role he could provide and whether that role is more valuable than the depth they already have. There is another proposed trade involving a familiar face, Mack Hollins. The idea would be for Philadelphia to acquire Hollins, who spent time with the Eagles earlier in his career. He was particularly memorable as a rookie in 2017, when he caught some important passes from Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. Since leaving Philadelphia, Hollins has moved around the league and developed a reputation as a physical player, willing blocker, pass catcher, and strong locker room presence. And that physical element is important. If the Eagles were looking for another receiver who could contribute in different ways, a player like Hollins could theoretically offer something different from some of the other receivers on the roster. But again, this is where the Eagles' depth becomes important. If Philadelphia already believes it has enough receivers to fill those roles, giving up an asset for another receiver might not be the best use of resources. That is why every trade idea has to be viewed through the bigger picture. The question is not simply, is this player good? The question is this player more valuable to the Eagles than the asset they would have to give up to acquire him?